and welcome to Genetics. In this session, we're going to continue our discussion about Mendelian traits and Mendelian inheritance, but we're going to apply it to human beings. Obviously, Mendel was using pea plants, and it is an interesting thing to take note that, yes, Mendel did use pea plants. However, it was not 100% clear at the time whether his work would necessarily be applicable to humans for one thing, or even, other organisms of different types. I mean, he showed it was true in peas, but a lot of other experiments did eventually show, and we'll get to this lots later, that pretty much the way it happens in his peas is the way it happens in all organisms. Now, of course, there are a lot of interesting sort of exceptions, and it gets very complicated, which is why we have to have the class. But what we want to focus on here is human genetics, and it turns out that many human traits, certainly not all, but many significant traits, both disease-causing and otherwise, do get inherited in humans in a relatively simple Mendelian fashion. Perhaps obviously, as I say here, you can't really experiment so freely with human beings. We can't say, all right, we're going to check this out. You mate with that one, and then we'll wait till you have offspring and we'll count them up. Aside from the obvious ethical considerations, it just wouldn't be practical because of the long generation time of human beings, right? Even if people volunteered for the study, it would take forever. But we do have a way around that, as it were. And we can use what's called a pedigree analysis. Really, all a pedigree analysis is a detailed family history. So we're looking back in time at someone's parents, grandparents, cousins, all sorts of things. And from that, it's almost as if just through what occurred, during what people did, the experiments have already been done for us in a way. We're looking at a bunch of, it is historical data. We're looking back in time, but you can almost pretend like, okay, what about these two original people? And they had these kids and they had those kids. And based on these diagrams and this evidence, we can try to deduce how, in fact, a human trait is inherited. So this pedigree analysis can often tell us one of the major things that we're interested in is whether a human allele is inherited in a dominant fashion or in a recessive fashion. Okay, so that's what we're going to devote this analysis to. And I'm not going to, certainly I would never say that any of this is easy. I think that, well, you'll see when we get to some of the more complicated looking pedigrees, just don't panic. Sometimes it's not as bad as you might think. So let's start with some basic ideas just about pedigree analysis and the way things are written. So this is a obviously fairly simple diagram, and what it's showing is two human individuals who either got married or didn't, but one way or another they had a child together. All right? So here are some conventions. A circle always refers to a female in these type of diagrams, and a square always refers to a male. Totally arbitrary, somebody just made that up, but that's the way it's always done. And you might notice that some of these individuals are not shaded, and this one here is shaded. Shading implies, see, this is often done for disease traits because we want to find out, for example, someone has cystic fibrosis. It's clearly a genetic disease because it runs in families. So if we want to start getting to the bottom of it, one of the fundamental things we need to know is whether it's inherited in a dominant or a recessive fashion. So in this case, what I'm going to say is shading means affected by the disease. So in this case, it doesn't have to be cystic fibrosis. It could be anything. But what we're saying here is that the two parents were not affected by the disease, and the child, who happens to be a girl in this case, was affected by the disease. Now remember, this is what happened. So if you were a genetic counselor or something, a couple would come to you and say, look, we don't know what's going on. We're perfectly healthy, but our daughter has this genetic disease. What do you think about that? And that's obviously more in a, a counseling setting. But from a perspective of just understanding the genetics, perhaps the first time this ever happened and someone said, whatever this disease is, we're going to look into how it's inherited. What information can we gather from even this simple diagram? And then we'll take that and apply it to some more complicated actual life histories. Okay? So I'm sorry to be redundant, but let's just state what it is. Remember, we always want to know what we're looking at. So we're looking at a female and a male that got together. When you have a line like this going between two people and then a drop down from them, that always means that they had a child. If they had more than one child, you would see this expanded out, and you could put as many individuals there as you want. But let's just keep it simple at the beginning. So we have two choices here, right? Either this is inherited in a dominant fashion or it's inherited in a recessive fashion. Seems simple enough, but how the heck can we figure it out? Well, what you have to do in all of these situations, guys, it's a little different than the way you're used to doing it so far, whether it's problem solving or even thinking about it. You're used to saying, I'm going to cross this with this and make predictions about the offspring. Sometimes they'll give you the data and you have to go back and deduce sort of what happened. This is more like that, right? You didn't initiate the cross, but it may as well be that way. Two people were crossed. We wouldn't say that with humans, but that's what happened. And the offspring came about. And unfortunately, they happen to have, let's just say it's a disease. It could be a regular trait like eye color or something. So what you have to do, guys, is almost become a detective. It really is like doing detective work, because you have to explore each possible situation and see if the data corresponds with one or the other. So let's just say we'll make a hypothesis, right? Meaning it doesn't necessarily need to be true, but this is a possibility. Let's explore if this were dominant first, right? So based on what you know about dominance, this affected individual here would have to, if dominant, right, think of what she would have to be. And let's arbitrarily use the letter A just because it's first. What we know about this girl is that she would have to be carrying at least one big A. I just want to make this 100% clear. We're going under an assumption, a hypothesis, that this allele is inherited in a dominant fashion. So then we're saying, all right, if that's true, then it must be true that she has one big A, right? We don't even know what she has, as you see here at the other position, because we can't tell that. That's the whole idea of dominance, right? What it means, though, is that she would have to get that big A from one of her parents, correct? It has to be so. But could she get it from either of these parents? The answer is no, but make sure you understand why. If either of these parents had the big A, even one of them, wouldn't they likewise be affected by the disease, as is she? The answer is yes, because you only need one copy of a dominant allele, as you know, for the trait to express itself. So when you see a situation like this, where a child is affected and neither of the parents are, dominance is pretty much ruled out. So I'm not saying, eventually when you get used to doing these, you'll look at that and you'll see right away that this can't be dominant. But let's follow through in the correct way. So if it was dominant, this would have to be true. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, is that possible given the data that we have? And it turns out it's not possible. So you then have to say, well, it might be tempting to just say, oh, well, then it must be recessive. But you have to go through with the analysis and say basically, all right, well, we think it's recessive, but let's see. Get rid of a lot of this mess. If it's recessive, what would we know? Again, starting over, new hypothesis. This is inherited in a recessive way. So what would we know about this girl who has the disease? If it's recessive, wouldn't it have to be true, using the letter A, that she's little a, little a? It has to be based on the definition of recessiveness, right? So She would have to be that way. And then we ask the same question that we asked before, which is, could it happen? In other words, she would have had to get one of the little a's from one parent and one of the little a's from another parent. Is that feasible? Is that consonant with the data? And it turns out it is, because if the parents were heterozygous carriers, that term is often used, whether it's a disease or not, for someone who has the allele, a heterozygote, but is not expressing it at the moment because it's recessive usually. So, don't get me wrong. There's no way right now you can prove that the genotypes of each of these parents, but what we're saying is, under what we can see the data actually is, it's possible that two unaffected parents could, if they are heterozygotes, produce an offspring which does have the disease in this case. So we definitely have found out here. Oh, I forgot that I animated that. It's a little redundant since I drew it, but there it is. Excuse me. So the answer here is that it is recessive. So you can start to sort of make a little either mental or actual inventory of, I wouldn't say tricks, but of just little things you can look at. So one of these things, it's sort of two sides of the same coin, but we can make two very definite statements regarding this type of a pedigree. If, and I said one of them already, if a child is affected, let's just say disease from now on for a while, I won't keep qualifying it. If they're affected by the disease and neither of their parents are, that pretty much means it can't be dominant. It must be recessive. Another way of looking at that is that if it were dominant, an affected child must have an affected parent, okay? So if one of these, let's just give a little scenario, which I didn't give you here, but if one of these, let's see if I can unanimate those. If this was shaded in, I don't know how to do that, but let's just use the highlighter and say, if one of the parents did in fact have the disease, that would change everything about our analysis, right? We would be able to say, well, look, maybe it was dominant because that offspring who has the disease also does have a parent that has the disease. Then we'd have to go along our analysis. But look, guys, there's no literal rule-by-rule framework for how to do this, but you always need to approach it in the same way, which is to say, okay, what's the data? And then make hypotheses. This is dominant. If it is, let's look at it and see if it's possible. If it's recessive, let's look at it and see if it's possible. Hopefully, one gets ruled out. You guys probably know it's easier to rule out or disprove a hypothesis than to rule it in, because that hardly makes even any sense. So what we did in this was basically to say it can't be dominant. And what we said in proper scientific language is that the evidence supports the idea that it's recessive. If it can't be dominant, we're saying that it is recessive, right? And that goes along with the evidence. So what we want to do now is look at some real-life pedigrees and see what we can make of them. Now, since this is a theory session, it's sort of like we're doing problem solving, but we're trying to understand how we're doing it and what it all means. So it's not really going to be much of a mystery, is my point. We're going to start out saying, well, let's do it. So here's a situation where we have an autosomal dominant pedigree. So we're sort of ruining the fun and telling you right at the beginning that this is a dominant one. Well, we could pretend if we want. Let's just get rid of that. That we don't know what it is. It's supposed to be an illustration of one that's dominant, and then we'll have some illustrations of ones that are recessive. But we can still approach it doing the type of detective work that you have to do. Now, what I said before about not panicking is obviously this is a lot more complicated than the one that we were just looking at. But it turns out, look, sometimes it's harder than others, and sometimes they want to torture you. I hate to say it. Other times, you have to be smart about how you look at these things. So let's pretend we don't know about it. Well, let's do two things. I'll make a couple observations just given the fact that we do know that it's dominant. Autosomal, by the way, is a term that just put it in the back of your mind. It means it doesn't have to do with sex linkage, but we didn't discuss that yet, so don't worry about it right now. it's a dominant pedigree. We see a bunch of individuals here, males and females who are having families and mating and all sorts of interesting stuff's going on. The shading is in purple here. We have some circles and some squares. Let me just show you a couple of things that we didn't actually discuss yet. In particular, sometimes they'll put on a pedigree analysis. If one of those lines is through the person, that usually means that they are currently deceased. In other words, they're no longer alive. And we have 5 generations here of a family. So, to have data about this generation, it's not really that shocking that the person's great-great-grandfather, I think, and grandmother are probably not living anymore. But the point is we can get data about them if we know for a fact that, great-great-great-grandpa did not have a disease, but great-great-grandma did. That's what allows us to construct something like this. Also, over here we see a diamond shape. The diamond shape means sex is not specified, either because it's not known or for whatever reason, but that's all that means basically is we don't know for a fact if it's a male or female, and in this type of analysis that really doesn't matter that much. Lastly, and we'll talk about this more later, when you see double lines like that, that refers to what's called a consanguineous relationship, which I'll be shocked if I can spell that right. Consanguineous, I think that's right. It basically means an ancestral type of relationship. I know that term is sort of taboo, but it means, and throughout human history, it really has not been that terribly uncommon for cousins of different types to marry or mate, depending on the culture and the society that they're living in. But that is not really to concern us, more the genetic, aspects of it. So if you see that double line, you can actually tell from this, from the fact that they are both in the same family and it's an extended family, that they're related. But the double line sort of is there to emphasize that. So we see a couple of things here. So what are we going to do with it? Because I want to erase all that stuff. Well, I'll leave it until it has to be erased, but I don't want it to complicate our analysis. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of these arrows. Yeah, let's get rid of everything. It's great to be spontaneous. Well, sometimes when you're solving problems, it's not so great to be spontaneous, but other times it is, and I'm not kidding. If it's a time deadline, you just have to do something. You have to make your best effort and go for it. Luckily, we have all the time in the world right now, so we're going to do it the proper way. But what is the proper way to approach something so complex looking as this? Now, let's pretend we don't know it's dominant. I apologize because I did want to make one observation. Given that we do know it's dominant, just note something that goes with what we said previously. That means that there's going to be individuals in every generation. In other words, think of it this way, guys. If there are kids here who have the disease, one of their parents had to have the disease, right? And that means that one of their parents had to have the disease, and one of their, and so on and so forth. It doesn't skip any generations. Dominant traits tend to be present in every single generation. So that's not certainly not enough by any stretch of the imagination. But the first thing you see when you look at this, let's go back to pretending we don't know, is, wow, look, every generation is there. That might spark an idea that it's dominant in your mind, but you still have to do the detective work. It's almost like literally being a criminal detective. You might say, I've seen this type of pattern before. I bet you that this is true. But that's not enough to go arrest somebody and put them in jail, right? Or whatever. So it's okay to have these thoughts in your mind, but you have to be open to the idea that this may be a situation that's a little different than usual. So I'm only using the dominant hypothesis because we got to do both. We have to say, could this be dominant? Could this be recessive, right? So our first hypothesis, because we're pretending we don't know from now on, is that this is dominant. So let's see if that's congruous with the evidence. So, you're looking at this, a lot of people, I didn't count them all up, from 5 generations. Where do you start? A lot of times, guys, they can even make it worse than this. There could be 8 generations with hundreds of individuals. That's probably a bit much, but it could happen. And the whole key could lie just in one little part of the pedigree. You don't even have to worry looking at the other parts. So when I do this, the first thing I look for is what we just saw, which is why I use that as an example. What I mean by that is, can I find 2 unaffected parents that have an affected offspring? If that's the case, I know that's going to be an interesting part of the pedigree. But as you look here, you'll notice that try as you might, you're not going to be able to find that situation. It doesn't exist. So that's not going to be able to help me. Nothing really stands out here. I'm lying a tiny bit, but we'll fix it at the end. Nothing really stands out here to me. So let's just zero in. It's always helpful. Look, you'll get overwhelmed if you just start saying, what about this family over here? What's going on over here? Look at particular little chunks of the pedigree and see what you can find out. So since this is a sort of theoretical session, let's ask ourselves, just as we did, about, under the assumption it's dominant, what would be the genotypes of these individuals, and let's see if it's true. So using our same letter A, what would we know about, for example, the individuals in generation 3 here? What could we know? Well, we'd know if they're affected by the disease, these two have to be big A and something else. They have to have one of the disease alleles, right? And that would mean that these 2 brother and sisters, they're all brothers and sisters, but 2 of them had the disease and 2 of them did not. They would have to be little a, right? Okay, so we have to say, is this feasible based on the data? And the data show us that the father, who is now deceased, did have this disease. The mother did not. So from the point of view of these individuals that have the disease, we have to ask, they got a big A, they had to get it from somewhere. Could they have gotten it from one of their parents? And the answer clearly is that yes, they could have got it from this parent, because since he has the disease, we know that he at least has one big A, right? So we're good with that. What about these individuals that don't have the disease? Could they have gotten a little a and a little a from both of their parents? Well, this woman didn't have the disease, so she would have to be little a, little a. And it is feasible that the father was a carrier. He was big A, little a. And if that was true, these individuals could have got 2 little a's from each of their parents. So certainly, based on that little part of it, and if you look at all the rest of the families, you have a similar situation. I shouldn't say the families, the other parts of this family tree. You're going to have a similar situation. So what we can say, again, it's not proof, but all of the data supports the hypothesis that this disease is inherited in a dominant fashion. But that's great, but we have to now check. I'm going to have to erase this, but you can always pause it or go back if you need to look at this again. It's fine to say, yeah, dominance looks good. And I know we already cheated because we know it's dominant, but let's see what would happen if we made the hypothesis that it's in fact recessive. Because sometimes things don't work out as cleanly and easily as you might think. Okay, so remember, we're putting ourselves in a different mindset as a detective and saying, okay, well, that's one hypothesis. It seems to have some support. But there's another hypothesis, and that is that maybe it's recessive. What if that's true? Let's see if that goes along with the data. Well, everything sort of changes around then, right? These 2 individuals who have the disease would have to be little a, right? And these individuals that don't have the disease basically means that they don't have little a, they have to have at least one big A, correct? And then again, we have to ask, is this reasonable? So what do we know about the parents, number 3 and 4 here? Well, without even saying anything else, if the hypothesis is that it's recessive, we know individual, we usually call it generation 2, so this guy would be called 2-3, that he's little a, right? What do we know about the mother here? That she has at least one big A, right? So let's ask ourselves, could these individuals with the disease under this scenario, could they have gotten a little a from each of their parents? Well, they definitely got one from that parent, right? And if this woman was a carrier, and I'm going to put a big mark over that because I just said if she's a carrier. Just keep that in the back of your mind for a second. They definitely could have gotten another little a from her, right? So actually, so far it seems to make sense that it's recessive as well. Now, these individuals who have at least one big A over here, we have to ask ourselves, all right, could they have gotten the big A from one of their parents? Well, sure, because we know that this individual has to have at least one big A. She should have given it to her. She could have given it to her offspring. And if you did a Punnett square of this cross, you'd find that there's a 50% chance of giving it on. And it doesn't always work out this way, but there's 50% of the offspring have it and 50 don't. So guys, unfortunately, this is also, the data seems to support that it's recessive as well. There's no way that we can, well, there's no easy way like we had before that we can rule out one of these two. So there's two things that you have to do at this point. Well, there's three possibilities, but I don't recommend one of them. One is that you get really frustrated, start to cry, and just leave. I should say that if that does occur, and I'm not kidding now, if it's possible, not during an exam, but during your homework, if you get really frustrated and upset, and I've seen it happen, it's happened to me, it's not a bad idea to take a little break, gather yourself, and then approach it with fresh eyes. Obviously, on an exam, you have to hang in there. But what we've got to do now is say, we don't seem to be getting anywhere here. So what else can we see here? Now, there is a rule. You can't just assume it, but if there's absolutely no other way, it's the best you can do. Very often, however, they will tell you this. And what I mean is the following. If in the question, if they had said, here's a pedigree showing the inheritance of a disease, and by the way, this disease is extremely rare in a population, okay? Extremely rare. Now, most genetic diseases are reasonably rare, right? But if they say like extremely, what that is a sort of code for, I don't know if code is the word, but what they're telling you is, look, this individual here, if you have the pedigree, that's where the disease allele came from. Anyone who's marrying into the family from the outside is not going to be having this allele, whether they're a carrier or regardless, unless the evidence proves that they actually do. So let me say that again. Under the situation where it's, quote, extremely rare, you can assume, unless the evidence shows otherwise, that someone marrying into the family from the outside is not a carrier of the disease allele. Okay? Sometimes that'll be stated explicitly, other times it won't be, and sometimes it's all you have to go on. So let's see why that fixes our problem here. If we go back to the recessive analysis that we were just doing, right? We had said, okay, under the situation that it's recessive, these two individuals had to get a little a from both of their parents, right? And we said, well, this guy's little a, so they're definitely getting it from him. But we said the mother had to have at least one big A. And we said, remember I made a little mark over it because I wanted you to keep that in the back of your mind? I said, if she's a carrier, she can give those offspring the little a. But under the extremely, I didn't finish, did I? Under the extremely rare rule, she can't be a carrier, right? Because it's so rare that someone coming from the outside is not carrying the little a here. So that means she has to be big A, big A. And under that scenario, all of the offspring of these individuals would be big A, little a, and none of them would be affected. So if it's extremely rare, then that does rule out the recessive possibility. That's extremely important. Let me say it again. Since she came from outside the family, we can assume under this scenario that she is not a carrier and therefore must give a big A to all of her offspring, which would mean none of them were affected by the disease. In the dominant situation, it wouldn't matter because look, remember the question, just for time's sake, I'm changing it a little. We're not going over the full analysis, but I'm just showing you why it won't matter because these diseased individuals, what we asked is they got to get big A from some parent, right? And we know this guy has at least one big A. So yeah, they could get it from him. In this case, see, the reason it doesn't matter is because whether it's rare or not, under that hypothesis, we already knew the mother is little a, right? Which means she's not. See, with the dominant, obviously the idea of a carrier doesn't even really exist. If you have the allele, you're going to have the trait. So basically, we know that she's giving a little a to all of her offspring. But in the dominant situation, you only need one big A to show the disease. So if we invoke the extremely rare clause, the rule like that, we are going to have evidence that supports dominance and rules out recessiveness. And that's why this is in fact a dominant pedigree. There's one more thing. Some of you might be saying, ooh, I saw something else that you didn't even see, Schmidt. You're supposed to be smart. Well, the jury's still out on that one. But you're right. There is something else on here. I wanted to save it for last because it's very often that you won't see something like this. And in the absence of this, we would have had to proceed exactly how we did proceed. But there is a special, interesting, fairly unlikely, but when someone's making up a problem, they can write anything they want. This consanguineous marriage between, let's just say cousins, because figuring out how they're cousins is a little bit daunting, and that whole thing about first cousins, second cousins, and different ones being removed, there's still arguments about what all that means. I mean, it is known, but let's just say they're cousins. And they're from different generations, but guys, for real, I mean, we would find this odd, but they're not that related, and even though they're from different generations, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is a great deal older than the other. Not that there's necessarily anything even wrong with that anyways. But the point of the matter is, this is a mating where we see something that we haven't seen before. So you can put this on your little list of sort of things to look for. I know that I ignored it. This would be the first thing you might see if you looked at this with fresh eyes. And that is when you have two parents, it doesn't really matter in this case that they happen to be cousins, but this often would happen if there were cousins in a dominant situation, right? Because here's what I'm saying. If we were back at the beginning asking ourselves if this was dominant or recessive, we'd say, okay, let's look at the recessive hypothesis, okay? Anyone with the disease is little a. And if both parents are like that, do a Punnett square if you need to, but what would that mean? That their offspring, this unidentified sex number 14, the reason they did that, by the way, just put 14 there, is there was a whole bunch of other offspring that they just wanted to highlight this one. It would have to have the disease too, if it was recessive, right? If the disease is recessive, and both parents have it, their offspring have to have it. It's simple as that. I hope you can see why. All there is little a's. That's all there is for the parents to give. So just that piece right there disproves or, removes the whole possibility of a recessive situation here. Just to be complete, let's see why it shows that dominance is fine. Each of these parents has at least one big A, right? But if they each have a little a, then they can give this to their offspring. So given that this is a dominant, under the hypothesis that it's dominant, two affected parents, listen, I said before that it's common that it doesn't skip a generation, but that's based on the idea that offspring who are affected have to have parents that are affected. Here's an unaffected offspring. It is possible if two dominant individuals, or I should say two individuals expressing a trait caused by a dominant allele, marry, and they are both carriers, there's a quarter percent, a 1/4 or 25% chance that their offspring, in fact, will not inherit the big A allele. So that's another thing to look for. We said there's two things to catch your eye. There's more than two, but at least two. Is looking for two unaffected parents that have an affected child, right? Which implies recessiveness. If you see two affected parents that have an unaffected child, like here, that implies strongly dominance. Okay? Wow, this is fun. Well, actually, it really is fun. Not when you're under pressure and stuff, but it's like being a detective. Everybody likes that, right? You go solve crimes. This isn't a crime, but it's a case, if you will. It's getting to the bottom of something using the evidence. And it's really, I already said it. It is fun in a certain sense to try and figure it out. When it gets difficult, but think of a real detective. That's what all the good movies are based on. It's like, this evidence is pointing this way, this is pointing this way. What the heck really happened? This isn't quite as complex as that, but it's a similar idea. All right, let's go on ahead. And we managed to fit three, aren't you glad? Three real autosomal recessive pedigrees right onto one page. Now, it's just like before. I mean, I'm telling you that they're recessive. Let's make some observations about that. The same about the autosomal. Right now, you don't have to worry about it. This will come into play in a later session. Right now, we want to know if it's dominant or recessive. Now, one thing's for sure, and that since we know it's recessive, we are seeing a lot of generations where the trait is not in existence. And that's all based on the thing that I'm hoping you're coming to recognize, is that if you see an affected individual, we said if it's dominant, it has to have affected parents, or one at least, right? But when you see, this is what we've been looking for, two unaffected parents with an affected offspring. That strongly implies recessiveness, right? So let's start with B, just because A is a little bit seemingly more complicated, right? It's more daunting. But here we have, right, a situation where we saw what we need to see. It's not so complicated, so we're looking at this whole family. But importantly, we have two unaffected parents, and we have some offspring that are affected. So let's make a hypothesis that this is recessive. The affected individuals have to be little a, right? This is just as we saw before. Can they get that from each of their parents? In other words, one little a from each. And they can only under the assumption that the parents are carriers, right? But that's okay. The other individuals must have at least one big A, and you can see that they could have inherited that from either of their parents, right? It's a little easier than the other one. But it's good form to say, all right, well, that's great, but what if it was dominant? If you have time. Guys, really, if you're in a time crunch and you can see that real quick, the two unaffected parents and the affected child, say recessive. But if you have the time, it's good to say, well, let me just see. What if it was dominant? And if it was dominant, the affected individuals have to have at least one big A, right? Could they have gotten that from their parents? We already know the answer is no, because if either of these parents had a big A, they would be shaded and they'd be affected, right? I don't want to, if it's not easy for you, I mean, it's okay, but that's easy compared with the last one, I would say. Now, see over here, it's pretty much, I mean, it's a different family, different actual people, but it's the exact same situation, right? We have unaffected parents, affected offspring. So I don't know if it's a really necessary use of our time to do the same analysis twice. Let's take a look over at the first one, though. And the reason, look, I understand it's 7 generations of a family. They didn't bother putting the little slashes through to say who's alive and who's dead here. It really doesn't matter. In fact, from a genetic perspective, it's totally irrelevant. What's relevant is that you know whether they had the disease or they didn't. Now, this is a situation which is really common in real life, to be honest. Well, part of it is, but in that, look, in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, nobody ever saw anything. Nobody knew anything was wrong. All of a sudden, in generation 6, we see offspring number 6-4, right, has this disease. And everyone said, what the heck could have happened? Well, that's from a perspective of humans, but from a genetic perspective, what do we need to know? We want to know if this is dominant or recessive. It's really the same analysis, guys. Or what if we look at these individuals here? What we see is under the hypothesis that it's recessive, the affected individual has to be little a, right? Could it have gotten it from the two parents? It could have if they were both carriers, right? And remember, if it was dominant, if this is getting boring and I'm serious, that's good because it means you understand it. We're almost done. If it was dominant, this affected individual would have had to get the big A from one of their parents, who would have then had to be affected, and they're not, right? So right there, you could say it's recessive. But there is one interesting aspect to this, guys. You may have noticed there's another consanguineous marriage here. Now, the way this is drawn, these people honestly aren't that related, but they're cousins of some nature. We could really figure it out if we wanted to. But the reason I bring this up is it's not really that going to be revolutionary with our analysis, but this does happen in real life. And what they're trying to show you here is every time, look, let's just say, let's look at this pedigree. We know it's recessive now, not just because we were told, because we looked at the evidence and we saw that it has to be. What it means is this, you guys. This individual was little a, right? This person, now this would go against, by the way, the extremely rare rule. Because this guy coming from outside the family is what it sort of took here. Well, it's not the only thing it took. For both these people had to be carriers, right? So it was just bad luck that this guy came in and he happened to be a carrier. But we can follow the little a allele sort of through this family. We know that aside from this guy, which we don't care about right now, this parent was big A, little a, right? We also know that this individual is affected. So both their parents had to be carriers, right? But what I mean is, so we're following the little a from this individual or this individual into both of their parents. Now, but what's interesting is this is one of the reasons why consanguineous matings, often referred to as incest, are frowned upon. It seems like second nature to most of us that you're not supposed to marry your cousin. But up until the 1800s, this was fairly common, especially in certain societies. Today, it's still common in some societies. But this is the reason, we think, why. It's because you can see what happened. Everything was going along fine till two people in the same family decided to mate. Lots of these people are carriers. But when carriers get together, they have a 1/4 chance of creating an offspring that actually is little a in this case, that has the disease, right? So these type of genetic diseases are much more common in a family where these types of matings occur. You can see this all over the place with royal families, where the whole idea was to keep things pure so that cousins marrying cousins and things like that was very normal in royalty. And in the family of Queen Elizabeth, I believe this is correct, hemophilia was running rampant through many generations of that extended family for this very reason. But anyway, look, this big A had to keep coming, the little a here and here had to be coming from somewhere. So all they drew here was people outside and inside the family. So let's follow the family. In that generation, there had to be a little a. In that generation, there had to be. That generation, there had to be, right? Who's in the family here? Little a, little a, little a. See what I mean? So by my saying there's had to be a little a there, all those people are carriers, in fact, right? You can go a long time through the years being carriers only if you... There's two things you can glean from this. If you have a consanguineous marriage, it doesn't mean it's going to have to happen. But look, these guys had 4 kids. It's not always this neat, but if you did a Punnett square, there's a 1/4 chance that they're going to have an offspring with the disease, and they got 1 out of 4. So a consanguineous marriage greatly increases the probability of this happening. The other thing that can happen is if you happen to run into a person who's a carrier, and back then and even today, You can't just say, "Oh, look at that, you're a carrier." You don't know. Sometimes, see, you can't know obviously just to look at a person, but even from family history, sometimes you don't know. And this is the reason. Look, all these generations where everything was fine. I actually know someone that very sadly this happened to, but I'm just using it as an example. Uh, a man and a woman had a child who had a very rare genetic disease. And for a long time, well, they're still not sure what happened, but it is inherited as a recessive. So they know that they're both carriers. But both of them said there's absolutely no family history of this disease that they know of. And you can see that I wouldn't say that the pairing was bad. I mean, they love their daughter, and it's just a hard situation. But my point is, two carriers, rare is rare, but it's possible that two carriers, not from the same family, run into each other and meet. So, for example, with cystic fibrosis, it's rare, but it's not extremely rare, meaning there's enough chance of two individuals who are unrelated being carriers that now they pretty much, as a matter of course, not everybody gets it, but they have a genetic test to see if you're a carrier. And if you are, and you're thinking of getting married, this is where ethical questions come into play. I'm not saying you shouldn't, it's none of my business, but you're armed with knowledge that, say, two carriers know that they're carriers. They know that there's going to be a 25% chance that if they have a child, it's going to have, say, cystic fibrosis if they're both carriers. They have to decide what they want to do about that. Okay. Well, it turns out that's the end of the analysis part. This last part is a lot easier. I just wanted to tell you that there are human genetic diseases. Well, you know this, but I want to tell you the specific ones that exist that are transmitted in a recessive way and which ones are transmitted in a dominant way. Now, I listed some diseases, some conditions, some just, quote, normal variants of traits. PKU, or phenylketonuria, I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but again, it's not common, but it's not ridiculously rare. That's a genetic disease inherited in a recessive fashion. So this always means, now, of course, if both parents actually had PKU, they know that their offspring is going to have it. And some of these diseases, unfortunately, are fatal at a certain age, so it's unlikely that two people with the disease would well, you never know. It depends on the disease. But I'm just saying, in most cases when this comes out, it's because both the parents were carriers, either knowingly or not knowingly. It's not about this right now, but PKU has to do with an inability to metabolize the amino enzyme phenylalanine. And I just mention it because we're going to get to this much later, but genetics has to do with metabolism, obviously, and in this case, they used to call them inborn errors of metabolism. Inborn meaning genetic in the old days. So it was a recognition that these were something you were born with and it was possibly inherited. In the older days, they would just know that by doing exactly what we did. What if they said, well, your grandparents had this disease. No one else seems to have it, so it must be running in your family. Cystic fibrosis, we just mentioned, it's a defect in a ion transporter that's inherited in a recessive way, strictly recessive. Albinism, you wouldn't say is a disease, but it's a condition where an individual can't produce melanin, and people who are albino can be of any race. Again, if two albinos were to have a child, they would be albino, but a lot of times the parent is a carrier. And blue eyes is a trait that I possess. I don't know if you can tell, but that's inherited in a recessive fashion. So, in fact, in my case, my mom has blue eyes, but my dad doesn't. But he must be a carrier of blue eyes, if you want to say it that way, right? We usually say carrier for a disease, but if you're expressing the dominant trait and you can have offspring that express the recessive trait, you must be a carrier. Dominant traits, most genetic diseases, you guys, are in fact recessive, and there's a reason why, but there are some that are dominant. Huntington's disease is one that unfortunately is, again, when I say fairly common, I mean they're all rare, but it wouldn't be crazy to know people who have this. I do. Huntington's it's a little bit, again, this doesn't have to do with the analysis, but the thing with Huntington's is if one of your parents has it, it means that you have a 50% chance of getting it, and you don't know because this is a weird disease that only manifests itself. It could be any time, but usually when you're 40, 50, 60 years old. So if you know one of your parents died from Huntington's and you feel fine, there's still a chance that you have the disease. It just hasn't come out yet. There are a lot of forms of muscular dystrophy, but the most common form, called Duchenne's, is inherited in a dominant fashion. And I said blue eyes were recessive, so brown eyes is a dominant trait. If you have one of the brown-eyed allele, you're going to have brown eyes. But can two brown-eyed people have a blue-eyed child? Obviously, yes, if they're both carriers, right? If they're both heterozygous. Okay, well, I really did have fun with this one. I hope you had as much fun as I did. And I'll see you again real soon at another genetics session.